It is the final day of 2023 and thusly the final update about Path of Exile 2 from Jonathan Rogers that I will be covering for the year. But worry not, there is so much coming down the pipeline. I have a slew of videos coming that we will talk about briefly at the end of this one. Plus, there was a channel update, the first and only one that I'll do this year. I'll only do one next year too. But if you're interested in that, the link is somewhere on screen right now. Anyways, let's hop right into the latest information about POE2 released by GGG and Jonathan Rogers. First up, we have this question by X-Lapsed. He asks, WASD movement in isometric environment concern? Not sure if anyone else has this concern. I've historically had minor issues with isometric games that use WASD controls for movement, i.e. the ascent, because the main movement directions are diagonal, which require two simultaneous key presses. I am wondering whether Path of Exile 2 is going to address this somehow. It wouldn't be a concern in most environments, but it might be an issue in some, where movement fidelity is important, i.e. Sanctum, Labyrinth. As far as I can tell from the demos so far, the main movement directions on maps are still in the diagonal directions. This probably wouldn't be a concern on consoles since analog sticks are a thing, and I'd also like to say you can set up controller support for PC on Path of Exile 2 and Path of Exile 1. However, I think Jonathan responds right here. Ooh, to Xylent World. It's an option. It might become the optimal playstyle, but who knows? And they're talking about using WASD or controllers. I agree that POE1 has been more diagonally laid out. It seems POE2, from what I can see on some trailers, is as well, especially the Mercenary. Also, from playing WASD, I don't think I ever found myself having an issue of why I am pressing two keys. Might be an issue long term if I'm blasting, but we have yet to see the end game of POE2. Jonathan responds to him and by proxy responds to X-Lapsed. He says, the reason you want a diagonal layout for artificial environments is because a lot of terrain features look bad when you have them in cardinal directions. For example, we have a straight wall bit here that makes it hard to see that there is a door in it. Let's take a look at the image. Okay, yep, right here. That's what he's talking about, I presume. In this case, we literally hung a lantern in it to attract your attention, and it's not so bad. We did discuss removing horizontal doors from this tile set entirely though. Let's take a look. Yep, see the lantern there. I just wanted to make sure I was actually accurate on where I was pointing the door out. Even in the other orientation though, I don't think you want to overuse it. Let's take a look at this image. Okay, so that's straight at the camera. It's very straight. It's not diagonal. Awesome. It makes for an interesting feature from time to time, but I don't think it's good to overuse. We played around with other areas having other interesting rotations too. Okay, let's check this out. Oh my goodness gracious, that's an interesting one. Oh, totally gonna be a bridge there, a magical bridge perhaps. Here is another one from that angle. Let's see, interesting. Wow, the thought that goes into stuff like this, me being a pleb and not a game designer, I never would have thought about all of what Jonathan is going into here, but it's so interesting, especially to how it relates with movement control. At first, it seems pretty cool. There are actually a lot of things to like artistically about angles like this. What I found though is that there is something fatiguing about playing in an area with an off-axis rotation. It's kind of hard to describe why, but after removing the angle offset, you just kind of go, ah, that's better. Okay. So Jonathan has opinions, okay? And I'm a huge fan of this. I've already made it known that Jonathan Rogers and Mark Roberts are extremely opinionated, and that's a good thing for POE2. They have a vision, they have a direction, and they are pushing POE2 in that direction, and that's better than just rolling over and letting everyone else dictate exactly how the game is made. They know what they want, they know what they think players want, and I know that phrase is hated and despised by the gaming community, but that is how Path of Exile came into being. Chris Wilson, Jonathan Rogers, and Eric Olofsson knew that there was a huge amount of interest in a game similar to Diablo 2 in the modern era with some new innovations. They had a vision, they had a design, and they enacted upon it, and they were 100% right. Their little independent studio has grown into a juggernaut. It was basically purchased by Tencent. It is making millions and millions and millions of dollars a year, and it's having the next flagship ARPG release in the coming years. So this is good, everybody. Okay, I know that I'm going on a tangent here, but obviously, Jonathan is so well researched. He understands stuff as minute as this, and he has a vision, and he uses words like, oh, when I was playing, it felt fatiguing, and after making this change, oh, that felt better. And he thinks that his vision and Mark's vision and the rest of GGG's vision will also go over well with many, many, many players once POE2 comes out. Okay, next question here from Bovino Gadoso 27. Controller skill slots. I don't remember if Jonathan mentioned this on stream, but how many skills will we be able to allocate on the controller? In POE1, there were 12 slots, if I'm not mistaken. How many will be on POE2? Jonathan goes ahead and responds, pretty meaty response here. He says, we have a different approach to the controller than before. There are technically 22 bind slots. That's 11 buttons, plus a second set if you hold down L2 by default, but you can change it to whatever key you want. However, non-skill actions are bound in the same slots, so dodge roll, any life flask, any mana flask, overlay map, and portal scroll are 5 actions that you are likely to want to have bound somewhere, leaving 15 remaining for other uses. Controller doesn't differentiate between skills and any other type of action, so you can bind anything anywhere you like, including the use of individual flasks. Like if you want some emergency flask on Y, then that's just fine. You are likely to want to keep the flask-related things on the D-pad, things like overlay map, portal scroll, or other rarely used things on L2 plus D-pad and dodge roll on L1. That gives you 12 easy-to-use skill slots, which I find to be plenty given that you get 8 skill gem sockets, and getting more than 4 skills from your gear would be unusual. As an example, on Mercenary, I like to put one crossbow's primary fire on R1, and my other crossbow's primary fire on R2. Then I like to put the attachments of the crossbow on L2 plus R1 and L2 plus R2. Then I put ammos on the face buttons, and then the other more rarely used skills on L2 plus face buttons. Okay, so Jonathan has extensively tested controllers for Path of Exile 2, which is super interesting. This guy, he goes in and he tests the heck out of the game, even though he is the game director. And I know, once again, that sounds strange, but I don't know if many other basically C-suite people at game companies test the game as extensively as Jonathan does, and I love that he's showcasing that knowledge right here. This isn't someone else coming in here and spreading opinions on behalf of Jonathan or GGG. This is Jonathan Rogers, and that's super cool. Now, actually onto the controllers. I've never played on the controller, so I don't have a lot of insight here, but my dad, who actually purchased Diablo 4 and played that game for a while, and he did enjoy it actually. I didn't enjoy it, as you guys know. He swapped from keyboard to using controller, and he absolutely loved it. And the fact that there aren't as many controller options in POE1 pushes him away from actually trying it out, and I think that occurs with a lot of other people as well. So it looks like in POE2 there are going to be many other controller options, so that's just a win overall, right? More options is good. It's just like, I love the fact that WASD is going to be in POE2, because even if I don't like it, lots and lots of other people absolutely thoroughly enjoy it and will use it in POE2, and there might be a ton of new players that are actually going to start playing because WASD is in the game. I don't see it as a loss. I do understand the outlook that some skills might be designed explicitly with WASD in mind, and that is unfortunate, but it's going to open up this game to so many more people who wouldn't play it if it was just point and click. So overall, it is a net win. Okay, we have an interesting question here from C. Michael V. Ragdoll physics and destructible objects in the environment. Will POE2 have any of this? Games like Grim Dawn, Diablo 3, Last Epoch, and even the ancient Titan Quest already have ragdolls for monster deaths. I realized there was a problem with corpse skills, but you could at least implement something very light. The corpses don't need to fly off screen, to avoid the repetitive death animations, which are just bad to look at after a while. Also, destructible objects in the environment like in D3 shouldn't create any problems, and it would make the combat feel better. POE2 looks so good. I love it, but everything is so static. It's like a wax museum. That's interesting. I don't think that at all when I look at it. Now, maybe let's see what he's talking about. This is what I'm talking about. He says it right here. Let's open up this image right here. Okay, so they all look completely the same right here. So all the werewolves are just laying flat on the ground, facing that same direction. I get what he means with this, but the rest of the game, not a wax museum. That looks to me extremely bad. Nobody said that corpses should fly off screen, do something very limited so that the body falls in the same position, but with different animations, and end with their limbs and body in different stances. I specified from the time I created this that flying corpses is not necessary, although personally, I would have loved that. But if people don't want that, at least something light to have the monsters end up in different poses when dead, that is all. Okay, so Jonathan responds to this and says, I don't love ragdoll on monsters because I think handcrafted death animations look better. One thing we are doing in POE2 though is that each monster will have 5 death animations, 1 for each direction and 1 directionless death. Interesting. Depending on the damage direction and if the monster is running or not, we play the correct one. A skill like Ground Slam would play the directionless death because the monsters are getting hit from below. Not every monster has had all their deaths created yet, which is why in the demos, they don't often demonstrate it. That's awesome. 5 different death animations for every monster, and I'm assuming this includes bosses that already have unique death animations, right? We've seen many of them in the actual tutorials and demos for Path of Exile 2. That's super cool. I'm not sure if it does address this guy's question, but he's going to be sad. He wants Ragdoll physics in here. This person responds Material Aka and says, handcrafted does look better 1 for 1, but it can look a little silly when you hit a pack of 15 of the same monster and they all belly flop in the exact same way and hold the same pose. Just to give a quick example of it happening in POE1, let's actually take a look at this example. Okay. Yep. Yeah. Oh, that doesn't look that bad. I mean, it looks, it doesn't look bad, but I get what he's saying. I get what's going on here. Kyoven says that could be easily solved with a few random variables thrown in for different parts of the animation, and it does look like that might be happening a little bit. We'll have to see what it looks like though. Now there is another response from Jonathan right here. When Yas Queen work, love the name. What about those destructible objects we saw on ArtStation? I'm referring to these, 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's check these out. Okay. Oh yeah. Stuff being blasted out, the books falling off, very cool. And this, what's breaking there? Oh, little pieces of the ground. Okay, cool. And Jonathan says, those are technically chests that open on damage. We do in fact have a bunch of those. Yes, that's awesome. Ooh, finally destructible chests. This is super, super cool. I've been waiting a long time for this. I hope most, if not all of them, are destructible and not stuff you have to actually click on to open. Okay, beefy question here from Calistri, and it is a controversial topic, everyone. Flasks and mana management in POE2. I get the impression from the Kripp interview that, given health potions won't be charging from common monsters, we will want to manage our usage of them over the course of fighting through a zone so they don't run out too quickly. I would expect then that to have some extent that may be the case with mana, and given the change where we use Spirit and we have a full mana pool, does this mean we will potentially be more concerned with the mana efficiency of skills as we add support gems or perhaps casting speed? I can see mana being anything from something we refill between attack sequences or between battles, or maybe even just once or twice per zone, depending on how much mana you have, how much mana regenerates, and how much potions refill. Potentially, this is even something that varies depending on the skills you're using and the passive nodes you've picked up. Of course, it's Path of Exile. I know there's a lot of concern among PoE players who prefer the current situation where it essentially feels like you have infinite mana, but I feel like I've played a lot of games where the tension between how many abilities you can use versus how many monsters you can kill with them are around is an enjoyable concern. So I will be pretty open-minded about whatever you want to do with Path of Exile 2. Jonathan does respond. Actually caring about your mana pool is something that you should have to do in POE2, and it is an explicit goal. As you said, the first thing we had to do to make that possible was removing the reservation system in favor of Spirit. This was one of the primary drivers behind that change, in fact. You can't make mana costs matter when you don't have a big enough buffer against them, and players will always choose a smaller buffer in exchange for more power, right? For refilling frequency, I would say that it is your flasks that are the real state of your character. Your mana orb can refill fairly quickly with mana regeneration stats, but if you use supports with high costs or supports with high mana multipliers, you are going to want to pack some mana flasks. It should of course be possible to make your build such that mana is no longer a concern regardless, but it will be at the cost of damage or defense. Okay, that's fine. I love puzzling it out. And of course, you're going to be able to create characters that are so incredibly powerful in Path of Exile 2 that you'll mitigate mana and you'll have insane defenses and insane damage. This is just adding another level that you have to optimize your characters at, because right now in Path of Exile 1, it is pretty minimal, let's be honest. That endgame, there are so many options available, and you basically optimize away your mana quite quickly. In Path of Exile 2, it seems like it might be a little bit more of a build-up, or you can choose to have one of your flasks be mana. And that's sensible too, because there's not going to be all those extra offensive and defensive layers on your flasks themselves. Granite flasks are gone, Quicksilver flasks are gone. You're just going to be having health, mana, I think a shielding flask too, and perhaps those flasks that help against certain types of elemental damage. I did answer this question too, and I got downvoted for it. I hope it is a problem during the campaign with many solutions we can puzzle around to mitigate entirely by the endgame, and it does look like that is going to be possible, as said by Jonathan, but it will come at the cost of other things in the game, defenses and damage. BF Booger says, so you want it to be the same as POE1 then? Not sure I agree. Not exactly, right? I mean, it can be an extra difficult part to puzzle your character around. It doesn't need to be just like POE1 where it's pretty simple and you've solved it, and you've solved it super quickly. I still do stand by the fact that we should have many solutions we can puzzle around, but perhaps it is a larger build-up than in POE1. That's all. Okay, this is a throwback to a question from a few videos ago, actually. Kebab Cardio asked, will we be able to chat in-game with people that are on different POE1 or POE2 servers? Is this a player-based division? And Jonathan had responded and said, yeah, you can chat between games. That is our intention. And I thought, oh my gosh, well, people are going to be super confused. This isn't going to be the default, right? Well, Jonathan did come back and said this: the public channels will not be mixed between games by default. Thank you, Jonathan. This would lead to so much confusion. All right, I'm sneaking in a little question and answer from the POE Ruthless subreddit because it does relate to POE2 just a bit. Given Jonathan Rogers' recent comments on Ruthless probably not getting improvements anytime soon, despite recognizing issues with endgame content, will you keep playing Ruthless? And that was from the Kripp interview. He basically said, people get mad when we make changes to Ruthless, so we're not really going to touch it right now. Jonathan actually came into the POE Ruthless subreddit and responded, saying, to be clear, tweaks are still being made over time and in the direction of making endgame content more available too. Kripp maintains this stuff. He also balances the league content for Ruthless each time we release something. But you are correct that there are probably not going to be any big splashy updates to Ruthless anytime soon. So for those of you who don't know, Kripp is one of the lead item designers in Path of Exile 1 and 2, and he also basically created Ruthless. He loves it, he maintains it, and it looks like those changes will come, but not anytime soon, and they're not going to be sweeping or massive. So yay for the Ruthless community. All right, this is a juicy one, Exiles. MCG123457 asks, will there be better information of player death in POE2? Before you say it, yes, I know that GGG has in multiple occasions declared that they wouldn't implement a death screen with damage taken and stuff. But in another one of his posts, GGG said that the game would pause on solo play. That is true. So why not implement a mechanic that pauses the game and snapshots your character when you die, so you can go through your buffs, debuffs, and character screens so you can work out exactly what went wrong and read everything on your character. Would this be a more acceptable solution for the problem? There's a chain right here that Jonathan responds to. Sharon Hendricks says, have they stated a reason why they don't want damage taken on death stats? Vice responds and says they addressed this a while back during an interview. Grizz Nectar responds and says, can't recall if this officially came from them, but the explanation I've seen is that deaths are very rarely due to one thing and are typically tons of different effects hit stacked on top of each other that kill you. Jonathan responds and says, it's not a strain on the servers. We would keep that information client side if we were doing it. It's just that it's a complicated UX task with a lot of considerations and a lot of tricky details. We could get 90% of the way there very easily, and the last 10% of making it correct or useful would require way more work. We don't currently have attribution to specific skills at all. It would be easy to say, fire damage killed you. It would be easy to say, the boss killed you. Harder to say, this corpse explosion skill did X damage to you, and much harder to say, this debuff resulted in Y extra damage to you. If it's not accurate, then it's kind of useless. So we would have to get this stuff done right. And to be completely honest, I just don't value it as much as other improvements we could make to the UX. It's not like it's off the table, but there is a lot of other UX improvements that would come first before implementing such a screen, so it's not very likely to be added. They're probably going to focus on adding updates to the passive skill tree and systems like that before they add this to the game, although I do think it would be useful. And even if it's not 100% of the way there, going 90% of the way is something that GGG does, right? They get a lot of stuff 90% right, and that last 10%, the extra polish, isn't in there. I think this would be a total fine add to Path of Exile, and it would just improve the game experience overall for a lot of people who just want that little extra bit of knowing how their character died. In my little time of playing Last Epoch so far, I have seen something like that. You know, when you die, you get a little bit of information about what killed you, and really, that would be great in Path of Exile 2 as well. Okay, an XP question. Stanton McChampion says, suggestion for XP penalty in maps. In the latest interview with Jonathan, he mentioned that there will be no XP penalty during the campaign, which is great in my opinion, since we are kind of expected to die a lot to the new bosses. But he also mentions that in maps there needs to be some sort of penalty to death. So my idea would be that the XP penalty is an explicit mod in maps, with higher magnitude and higher map tiers. For example, white maps 3%, yellow maps 5%, red maps 10%. This would allow the option of fragments and invitations, or whatever their equivalent is in PoE2, not necessarily having an XP penalty. This also allows the possibility for the XP penalty to be tweaked individually for each different endgame activity outside of maps. What do you guys think? Jonathan responds and says, basing it on map tier is pretty reasonable, and something suggested internally as well. I just don't love the idea of having different rules for different outside map endgame activities though. I just worry it's something that you will easily miss, and having to remember what activities do what is a bit of a pain. Ideally, we can come up with a consistent rule that is easy to understand and remember, and I totally agree with them. I don't even think the 10% rule is said anywhere in Path of Exile 1. You just kind of see it when you lose XP when you die. And if that's not going to be in game and you have to keep track mentally about all the different areas of the game and where you lose XP, that would suck. I do like this person's suggestion though. I like XP penalty on death. I know a lot of people in the comments say they hate it. Some people actually agree with me and do enjoy it, and a lot of people are indifferent, but I do think this adds to the game experience and progression and really makes you work your way to level 100, especially if in Path of Exile 2, there aren't cheesy ways to get to level 100 like 5 ways in Path of Exile 1. Okay, we got a beefy discussion on the logout macro in Path of Exile 2. Phil Sons says, logout macro is still a thing in PoE2? At ExileCon, Mark talked about the system where if you log out, the game pauses at that moment until you log back in and take an action, and then everything will resume as it would have. But in the recent interview, Jonathan said, you can always log out and reset the boss fight. If you Alt F4, ultimately that ends the boss fight. So was that system scrapped, or am I misunderstanding something? Now, I saw briefly Jonathan's answer, and it is big. Jonathan says, okay, so here are the specifics. If you are playing single player and you log out, the instance is paused. If you then log back in, you will resume right where you were so long as the instance is still open. Instance timeout is still a thing. It seems very clear to me looking at it now that when logging in, we will have to present an option to the player about if you would like to log into the existing instance or log into town and lose the instance, so that if you do want to reset the boss, you don't have to wait. In multiplayer, if you log out, the instance is not paused. In this case, if you were in a boss fight, then you are not allowed back into that instance again and will log back into town. This is really the only approach to prevent abuse. The abuse, and what Mark was originally talking about at ExileCon, is the fact that we don't want you to log out, log in order to dodge an ability, then continue the boss fight. That is important for maintaining integrity of the fight. We don't want it so that log out, log in is the meta for dodging some long and hard to dodge boss ability. Maven memory game. A Searing Exarch ball face. That being said, you can always Alt F4 to abort a boss fight if you see a death coming, and you will not lose your hardcore character. You will need to start the boss again from scratch though. This sounds like a great system. Omega Cybers is right. This sounds like a great idea. Love your approach to actively listen to user feedback. Everything here sounds fantastic. I'd like to read in a little bit to this multiplayer piece. The more we hear about multiplayer, the more differences that we're seeing between single player and multiplayer. For example, in single player, you can pause the game. In multiplayer, you can't. It almost sounds like they're going to be separate game modes entirely. That's probably not going to be the case because of trade, but I feel like partying up and joining and playing with friends is going to be far more in depth than it is currently in PoE1. We have to wait to see if GGG is going to reveal more about that, but the more they talk about the differences between single player mode and multiplayer mode, the more and more that I think that that is a real possibility, that there's some big differences between the two, and it's going to be more in depth, way more in depth than in Path of Exile 1. After all, it was one of the mainstays of that number 3 trailer for Path of Exile 2, the fact that you can have 6-person co-op. So we'll have to see, won't we, Exiles? There's a thread here with the Kripparian interview on the Path of Exile subreddit that saw some more discussion from Jonathan and from myself, wherein I was dunked upon and I got downvoted extremely because I was pretty much wrong. I haven't responded saying I was wrong. After I re-listened to the interview, I kind of saw it. I said, oh, there's all this stuff from the interview. Somebody said, oh, you know, he didn't actually say that. And I was like, no, he totally did say that. And the guy said, no, he literally didn't say that. And then I listened to it again last night, and I think this person is right. So I really need to go, there's the downvotes. I need to go back and say, dude, I was actually wrong. So sorry about the argument. Sometimes I just lose out on sleep, right? Okay, but I really wanted to talk about this response right here from Jonathan, which is on the whole disparity between the top end players and the average player. Golgol12 says, paraphrasing, and this is Jonathan talking right here, right? I believe the income disparity per hour between the top player and average player should be 1,000 times. I believe we shouldn't force you to play something you don't want to just to get more loot per hour. This was near the 2-hour, 9-minute mark of the VOD. And then Gold says, please, Jonathan, pick one. There will always be a meta for best build, and that forces the best players to play the meta build just to get to the top loot per hour. Jonathan leaps right into this one and says, I don't accept that there will always be a best build. There should ideally be good builds with many classes and skills. Hopefully you would agree that we were able to get a reasonable variety in POE1 with top tier builds. It's true. We do have pretty good variety in POE1. If we just go to POE Ninja right now, we're going to see the builds are obviously dominated by Deadeyes. But then look, Pathfinder 12%, Inquisitor 8, Champion 6, Elementalist 6, Occultist 6, Guardian 6, Ascendant 5, Necromancer 5, Hierophant, Chieftain. Chieftain is 5%. It's more than Juggernaut this league. I can't believe that. But there is a lot of build variety in POE1. In POE2, 36 Ascendancies. I think that might be pretty similar. We'll have to see what happens, but I think they have done a great job with that. Of course, there are outliers, you know, like the Explodey Totem build of Crucible League, and I know that in Legion League, Cyclone was absolutely insane on the Slayer, but really, they've done a good job for having a game with 30 plus leagues and a ton of balance changes and stuff that could potentially be abused. The conversation continues right here with I Hate Reddit, who says, it's honestly insane when you consider they balance drops, crafting, and build progression not on the average player. If the average player does half a div an hour, are they expecting top players to be doing 500 div per hour? Jonathan says, I think you highly overestimate the average player. Also, you might think 1,000 times is high, but in POE1 right now, the disparity is much, much higher than that. Yeah, I'm thinking of MP's 6-man group right here who's getting tons of Divines and Zizzarin and Steel Mage and Bro solo self-found. They're getting tons of stuff. I do believe that the disparity is kind of ridiculous. We'll have to see what they accomplish in Path of Exile 2. This league has been an outlier, honestly, for me, even in terms of loot and the amount of money that I'm able to make. And, you know, I'm doing invitation farming and stuff, and I'm making quite a bit. You know, Maven's Writ sell for 2.5 Divine Orbs, guys. It's really easy. You should go for that bossing invitation strat. But, you know, it's interesting, and I know that a lot of people get quite heated about the topic, so I'm just gonna stay away from it for now. We'll talk about it later. We'll have plenty of time to discuss loot in Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2. Now, before we close out the video, I do have a question that is sitting currently on the Path of Exile 2 subreddit, and it's just, all 6 new classes have been showcased, not knowing their ascendancies. Which are you most excited to play? Now, if you haven't already, please go here to the subreddit, answer this question in the comments below. You can answer it too, or just send me a message in our Discord chat. I'm really curious to see, because after the most impactful change from Path of Exile 1 to Path of Exile 2 video, which is coming out early next year, wow, that's crazy to say, this will be the next video after that. I really want to encourage and foster discussion in the Path of Exile 2 community that is positive. Everything in this subreddit really has been positive, except me getting downvoted into oblivion, right? But I'm just joking. It's been good, and I want to continue fostering that sort of thing, especially between us and GGG, because everyone, this is good. We want to keep respecting them. We want to be positive with them. It's awesome that they're talking to us and taking our feedback directly again. It's awesome. Let's keep it up. All right, my fellow exiles, that is the last video of 2023 on Talkative Try. I hope you enjoyed it. There will be a ton more content coming in 2024. I'm aiming for 1 video per day. I'm going to be streaming on Twitch and YouTube on Wednesdays starting at 9:00 p.m. Eastern. That's going to be fun too. We'll play Path of Exile, we'll play Last Epoch, and other games we'll have to see. Anyways, that's all for this video. Tala Moana, Exiles.